Hi, everybody, and welcome to Common Narrative. I'm Crystal Haynes. We're actually doing the show from my home because, COVID is what it is. And I really appreciate all of my guests coming in because we're going to bring them all into the room. But first, let's talk about Common Narrative. Common Narrative really examines the media's effect on public perception and civic engagement across all lines of diversity. And we want to talk about a very important topic that may not connect to you in your homes, but it does. At least that might be your perception. A recent poll shows that Americans, by roughly 2-1 margin, say that the Supreme Court should uphold Roe versus Wade, the 1973 decision that legalized abortion, faces a direct challenge this court term in the Supreme Court. Now, on December 1st, justices will hear oral arguments over a Mississippi law that bans abortion after 15 weeks. And the court is currently weighing Texas's controversial 6-week abortion ban, which was argued before justices on November 1st, and the case is moving quickly. So I want to go ahead and bring my guests on into the room as they come on in here. And I want to introduce you to Carol Rose from the ACLU of Massachusetts and Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts board chair and constitutional law professor Renee Landers. Thank you so much for joining me, ladies. I appreciate that.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
So I broke down a little bit of these two cases. However, we know that this is not necessarily the only challenge, or that to Roe versus Wade that we've heard of, or perhaps even has been following. So I want to play some sound from the Supreme Court. This is connected to the actual Texas challenge here. And I want to play that to our listeners and our viewers on the stream. And then we'll start breaking it down because I don't speak legalese, but I know you ladies all do. So let's go ahead and play that for folks.
Texas designed SB 8 to thwart the supremacy of federal law and open defiance of our constitutional structure. States are free to ask this court to reconsider its constitutional precedents, but they are not free to place themselves above this court, nullify the court's decisions in their borders, and block the judicial review necessary to vindicate federal rights.
So this is a unique situation. I think the real danger is if this court does not allow this suit, then that will provide a roadmap for other states to abrogate other rights that have been recognized by this court.
It could be free speech rights, it could be free exercise of religion rights, it could be Second Amendment rights. If this position is accepted here, the theory of the amicus brief is that it can be easily replicated in other states that disfavor other constitutional rights.
I think what Justice Breyer is suggesting is that the entire point of this law, its purpose and its effect, is to find the chink in the armor of Ex parte Young. And the fact that after, these many years, some geniuses came up with a way to evade the commands of that decision, as well as the command that the even broader principle that states are not to nullify federal constitutional rights. And to say, we've never seen this before, so we can't do anything about it. I guess I just don't understand the argument.
And so that video and the audio that you're hearing, that's from the Associated Press. So I want to give them credit for that and being able to pull that. So either of you, I want you to jump in and sort of break down what is happening in the Texas case and what's happening in the Mississippi case for folks who may not be following the news or may not understand these concepts.
Well, I'll take I'll first run at it, and then I'll defer to Renee's greater expertise on the constitutional law. So basically, we have two different challenges to access to abortion care and medical care for people. The first has to do in Texas with what people are hearing about SB 8, which is basically a law that would say that that you cannot access an abortion after there's a fetal heartbeat. So that would be usually around 6 weeks before most people even know that they might even be pregnant. And what's really, and what you're hearing about in that case, and this was a case that the Supreme Court heard two challenges to this Texas SB 8 law on November 1st. And what makes the law so incredibly unique is that it not only says that that people can't access abortion care once there's a heartbeat, but it makes no exception for things like rape or incest or life of the mother or anything else. But it actually creates a bounty clause that says that the law can't be enforced by state officials, but rather would be enforced through a bounty with other people completely unrelated to the person seeking the abortion care, or to the state or anyone else, can actually go after anyone who helps and aids them in getting abortion care. That could be the taxi driver who takes them. It could be a religious person who's giving them advice or help, a friend who works with that person, and gives an option for a bounty at $10,000 if they bring that case. And what's really challenging there is if you permit that in this instance, you could do it any other time someone's constitutional rights are violated if a state doesn't agree with it. So right to access abortion is protected under Roe v. Wade under the Constitution. So if you say that a state could pass a law and create a bounty system for denying access to constitutional rights in this instance, there's really no limiting factor in other constitutional rights that a state could decide to take away. So that's the sort of broad overview of the Texas law. And Renee, I'll turn it over to you to maybe give more clarity than I was able to just.
Well, no, I think that was an excellent summary, Carol. So I would say that the challenge it presents for people who want to vindicate and maintain the rights of people to have abortions in a state like Texas with this law is that the state's idea by creating this bounty system was to try to indicate that the state was not involved in enforcing the law, because the typical way, and the Mississippi case that you referred to earlier, Crystal, is an example of this. The typical way is the state passes a law outlawing abortion after a certain period of time. In the Mississippi case, it's 15 weeks, not the 6 weeks at issue in the Texas case, and which is also unconstitutional under Roe v. Wade. And then abortion providers can challenge that law by suing the state. And here in Texas, the state has tried to say, well, we're not really enforcing the law. It's just these private people who are enforcing the law. So you have to, sue, defend, a suit by them anytime they seek to collect the bounty against a person who might have helped a person obtain an abortion. And so that is the novel aspect of this law. But what I would say to all those people, and it came out in aspects of the oral argument, excerpts that you did not play, and that's not a criticism of the excerpts you had. I thought they were excellent ones. But what came out in the oral arguments is that actually by having to go to court to collect the bounty, that involves the state in enforcing the law. And there are cases, dating from the civil rights era, which, have said that going into court to try to enforce an unconstitutional law, it involves the state in the enforcement, and therefore is unconstitutional. So I think that ultimately this idea, the strategy on the part of the state of Texas is not going to be successful, because that is the ultimate issue. If there's going to be given legal effect to the ban on abortion, then by the courts of the state of Texas is involved in enforcing the law in an unconstitutional way.
I think that's right. And I think one of the things that we're going to see. So that was the argument for that was on November 1st, and we're waiting now for how the court's ultimately going to rule. Initially, the trial court, the Supreme Court sent it back to the trial court, and the trial court said, yeah, we shouldn't continue with this approach. And then the appellate court above that, which is between the trial court and the Supreme Court, actually said, we're going to let SB 8 stay in effect until such time as the Supreme Court rules on the merits. Now, as Renee said, there seems to be, based on the oral argument on November 1st, a lot of skepticism, even on the part of the conservative justices like Brett Kavanaugh or Amy Coney Barrett, who seem to have a lot of concerns about what does that mean for the role of the court if the states can merely bypass the Constitution by coming up with these clever bounty kind of mechanisms. That really undermines the legitimacy of the federal judiciary and of the Supreme Court in particular. So I think that's why, that's absolutely right, that I think likely this approach is likely to fail because it really is going to open up a Pandora's box of other efforts to undermine constitutional liberties, including things that the court may, in fact, be sympathetic to, things like gun control and individual gun owner rights. So I think that from a procedural point of view is, too clever by half and is likely to fail. Less likely to fail, unfortunately, I think is going to be the court hearing that's going to be coming up on December 1st, which is in the Mississippi case, which basically is just a straight out effort by Mississippi to ban access to abortion after 15 weeks. Now, under Roe v. Wade, states cannot take away the right to abortion access before what's called fetal viability, which is usually around 24 weeks. So by doing this, it's just a direct, straight front attack on the constitutionality of Roe versus Wade. And that, I think, we'll see what happens with those arguments on December 1st. And the court will likely rule probably in between like May and June of next year, will issue its ruling. But I think that's a more direct attack on abortion rights, and maybe the case that is more concerning to those of us who care a lot about a woman's access and a person's access to reproductive health care.
I would.
Well, hold on, Renee. I really want to talk about, because I don't want folks to get sort of lost too, because you all are very educated. I'm curious about the timing of this, because while challenges to Roe v. Wade certainly are not new, it seems like there are many challenges happening all at once very recently. And does that have to do with the political climate? Is it something that's always been sort of coming down the pike, this culmination of several challenges at once, or is it just the media is paying attention to it now?
I think it has to do with that these attempts to undermine Roe have always been with us. But I think right now that some of these states where the political leaders of the state are opponents of abortion rights feel emboldened by the new composition of the Supreme Court. Now they perceive that they have perhaps a majority of justices who would vote in a challenge to one of these laws to overturn or at least seriously undermine Roe versus Wade. And that's why we see this convergence of a lot of different laws happening at this time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think we're seeing, a widespread, if you would, politicization of things like access to healthcare. And it's just sort of the nature of what's going on in the climate right now. And I think that there are real direct implications about control over our bodies. And those have gender justice implications, those have racial justice implications. And we're seeing that sort of politicized in a way that has been happening for many years. But I agree with you, has certainly accelerated over the last few years as this access or the decision about whether women and people are going to have autonomy over our bodies becomes a larger and larger issue on the political landscape in this country.
So then what does that mean in terms of the outcomes of these challenges? Like, is the Supreme Court just going to hear these cases and respond and react to them in normal case, or, as normal, or is the political climate a major influencer on the court?
I think there is a dialogue between involving the political climate in the court, public opinion in the court. The court is very aware that the persuasive power of its decisions and the public's willingness to accept the results of its decisions are the only power that the court has. The court, doesn't have a budget like the Congress. It has no executive authority like the president. And so it's very important for the court to push people to accept valid constitutional rights like improvements, in segregation during the 60s, those kinds of decisions. But it's also very important that the court not do things that are dramatically opposed to what the public is willing to accept, because it has no ability to control, how the public reacts to it. So I think that's one really important thing that's going to constrain or limit the range of options for the court. And I think we saw that in this litigation over the Texas law, because the opponents of the law, the people who challenged the Texas law, first sought review in the Supreme Court to get the Supreme Court to order a stay, a delay in the enforcement of that law until the Supreme Court could decide, the lower courts and the Supreme Court could decide about the merits, whether, it was consistent or inconsistent with Roe v. Wade. And in a really unprecedented radical act, the court refused to sort of maintain the status quo until we had a final decision on that, on the validity of the Texas law. I think that was a trial balloon by the court. I think the court was trying to test, really, is it going to be so bad? Are people going to really want to defend the right to abortion? And I think the reason that they had this set of hearings on November 1st is that they found out, yes, actually people do care. And it is a problem that they didn't take that action. And sadly, they still haven't taken the action to maintain the status quo, but they seem to have promised to try to come out with a decision, in a more rapidly, to try to resolve some of the confusion that's going on in Texas now. But I think that was a trial balloon, and I think that was the court really trying to test the political waters about the acceptability of a really radical anti-abortion stance.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, anyone who thinks that judges are just calling balls and strikes isn't paying too much attention to the courts. I think that there, as Renee says, there's sort of two factors. One is there's the institutional. The court wants to be respected as an institution. And so, you really saw that some of the justices were out there saying, we're not political hacks and things like that, as if that was begging the question a bit, right? So it was a matter of institutional integrity. They can't do, or they shouldn't be doing things that are perceived that way. The second is, I think that we need to recognize that the courts are subject to the political changes, and courts very rarely are leading the charge. And we just think about the equal marriage battle, right, where we won it first here in Massachusetts and then across the country in various cases in various states. And the Supreme Court weighed in only after the political conversation had changed, and I like to think of it as though, the courts put the exclamation point on the end of a political conversation or a political movement. The courts rarely start and change the political conversation, but they often end it. They put the exclamation point. So what we do as voters, as people in the public conversation around these really important constitutional rights, I think really has a big influence on where the court ultimately is going to land. So I think that there's hope through action and activism.
I am curious, though. I mean, it seems that the media and the way we cover it, I think because approaching a court case, especially approaching a Supreme Court case with all its many layers, makes it very difficult to, crystallize it into 90 seconds on a television program. So does that help or hinder the particular cause? Because as you mentioned, Carol, the outcomes of the courts is something that people have to live with. Women will have to live with the outcome of these cases and whatever the Supreme Court decides in them, and maybe blindsided because it's difficult to, report on in a succinct way. Right. In what way does the media hurt the cause?
Well, I think one thing is to pretend that there's a false equivalency, that this is not just about one side versus the other side in a political debate. This is about a fundamental conversation about whether or not the state is going to control women's in people's bodies around reproductive health care. I mean, we know there is no more important decision that many of us make about whether we want to start a family. It's an economic decision. It's an equal rights decision. It's a personal autonomy decision. These are fundamental decisions about our autonomy, our very being, who controls our bodies. And whatever people feel sort of morally about abortion rights, the fact is, do you want to have it be your personal decision, or should it be the government far away making those decisions about your future economically, personally, and physically? And I think it's really important that as the media covers these, that we frame it that way, that we frame it as a racial justice right. We frame it as a gender right, to have access to health care, including abortion care, and not just see it as we're reporting on one side, on the other side, as though they're actually equivalent, because they're not actually equivalent. And this isn't just a political battle. This is really a battle over the future of equal rights in America.
I would agree with that. I think that, so first I want to say about the media, that I think the media, as we see in some of these countries around the world where the media has been really constrained by demagogues in some countries, sadly, in the 21st century. And so the media really does play a very important role in the United States in informing the public about what the government is doing and what people's rights are. But I do think that it is not helpful to sort of try to present everything as the sky is falling on every single issue. I think that having a nuanced discussion of what this right to abortion means in people's lives, and not pitting it as just this, on the one hand the opponents, on the other hand the people who favor abortion rights, is not a very helpful and nuanced way to inform the public about the conversation. The other thing that I think that really frustrates me about the conversation is that that approach lends itself to a presentation of the issue as, all people want to be parents. The highest and best use of particularly a woman's time is to, become a parent and to take care of children. What it fails to recognize is that there are a whole lot of complicated issues with people being pregnant and having children. The health risks of carrying a pregnancy to term are far greater than to a person who's carrying a child who's pregnant. They're far greater than they are for a person who has an abortion early in the term of the pregnancy, as most abortions take place in the United States. Also, we have a woeful underfunding of healthcare for and access to healthcare for women, and particularly disproportionately people of color, and for children. And Texas is one of the states which has refused to accept the Medicaid expansion, which would expand healthcare access across a whole range of services to millions of people in Texas, and it refuses to do so. And so it just strikes me as this, it's being hyper hypocritical, and this is not a concern for public health, the health of parents, the health of children, this opposition to abortion. It's just another way in which the state can refuse to support people in their ordinary and daily lives.
I'm interested in that piece in terms of that people don't frame it, or the media, I won't say people, the media doesn't frame it as a public health issue, but always one that seems to be a moral issue or a racial equity issue. It doesn't frame it as. I'm curious as to, is it because framing it as the other particular aspects that it is a public health issue, a racial equity issue, then makes it look like bias, and so do you think that that's the concern of the media? And maybe it's a question I'm better suited to answer, but I'm wondering if that's the impression that the media is giving, that if they don't dive deep and don't like do what I call level 2 thinking, then it gives them some sort of air of impartiality. Is that the impression that you all sort of get from that?
Well, I would speak to that. I mean, I was a longtime journalist, so I spent 10 years as a journalist, and I think that there is pressure to have sort of a false sense of neutrality or a false equivalency. So I'm just going to report on one side set and then on the other side set, and if one side has a more simplistic message or a message that's easier to grasp or sort of seems more morally fraught, right? Then it becomes easier to report on that. Whereas if the other side has a more nuanced approach, then it becomes harder to report on that. And particularly when we don't have the benefit, like we do today, of this really wonderful open forum where we can talk about things in depth. It's really tough for reporters to simplify something into a soundbite that actually gets to the complexity of the underlying issues. Because when you talk about reproductive health care, which we are talking about health care, and healthcare is a human right, and healthcare is a racial justice right, and healthcare is a gender issue, and healthcare is a human rights issue. So we have to frame it that way, both those of us who are advocates, but also for people in the media, so that they can try to fit it into that smaller news hole that we're all having to operate under. So I don't think it's that the media is necessarily biased one way or the other, but that they're actually constrained by the lack of a level 2, as you say, platform to be able to talk about these issues. But at bottom, I do think this is about a question that's about fundamental human rights, and access to healthcare is a human right, and abortion care is part of healthcare.
Absolutely. I agree with everything that Carol just said. I also want to say that I think that it's that the media is taking false comfort in this supposedly neutral stance, because what I would argue is that the media in some ways has been co-opted by the criticism of people who want to keep the issues simplistic and seemingly, well, it's just, a moral issue, right or wrong, as opposed to really understanding the complexities of people's lives. So I would say that by trying to appear to be neutral, the media actually is taking a side and becoming unbalanced, because it is not exploring some of these nuances in this discussion on this issue. And I do agree that reproductive health care, obviously, Planned Parenthood views it as a much, essential component of healthcare for every person of every gender, race, sexual identity in the country. And we should be advocating for the inclusion of really sound, scientifically based reproductive health care in the healthcare for every person in the country.
Do you think because of this, the nuanced look of things and people being more aware of that is the reason why some big name or federal conservative lawmakers have really not weighed in too heavily on this particular issue, especially when we're talking about the Texas challenge to Roe v. Wade and the abortion law? It seems like there's a lot of state and local push, but I know a lot of reporters tried to get Mitch McConnell on the record for this, and he was just kind of, there's a lot of ducking and dodging. Is it because this is a nuanced issue and these big, kitchen table issues are already in other pieces of laws that are needing to be passed under the Biden administration? Do you think that that's kind of why they're steering away from it? Because there are so many layers to this that touch other people, other things, and other agendas that are happening on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I think that this, in so many ways, and unfortunately, abortion has become sort of a litmus test issue for a lot of people who want to get other things done. So they're willing to trade away our rights to access to reproductive health care because they want to pass other things or get other things done, or they're just fearful. And that's really too bad, because to be honest with you, abortion is a very safe procedure. It isn't a complex procedure, unlike pregnancy itself. And access to having all kinds of health care is actually super popular among people. But when it becomes turned into sort of a moral issue instead of actually a healthcare issue, then it becomes hard for politicians to show courage. And that's where it becomes really important for those of us who are in the advocacy world, like the ACLU, like Planned Parenthood, to make sure that we continue to help people to understand that abortion is actually should be safe. We hope it's as rare as it can be, which is when you make it possible, you can do that. But I think if we think about going back to the bad old days, that's really a problem that we should keep in mind when we talk to people about it. My father actually was a physician, and he became very impassioned about the importance of having access to safe legal abortion, because he saw so many young women who were coming in dead from trying to self-induce an abortion on their own and not being able to do it in a medically safe way. And that was before Roe v. Wade. And I think for a lot of people in this generation, they don't recall that. They don't remember how bad it used to be, and how bad it can become, and how bad it's becoming in places like Texas, where now people are being forced to drive or to travel, hundreds of miles in order to access basic medical care that actually isn't complicated and actually is quite safe. So I think that it's important that we continue to have the conversation and to take the, if you would, politics out of it as much as we can, because I think that's why politicians become fearful to do the right thing.
I agree. I think there is a lack of political courage on a whole range of issues, not just this one, in the current political sphere. And I think that it makes you question why people go into politics in the first place. Because if the goal is just to have a position and have some power sometimes over some issues, then I guess this is the right approach. But it seems to me that we should have higher expectations for our politicians, that they will actually try to advocate for policies and support policies, vote for policies that improve people's lives. And right now, you mentioned Mitch McConnell, so he appears to have taken this position that whatever will resonate with the most conservative Republican base in the country is the position he will take, and he will remain silent on other issues that might be broadly popular because he doesn't want to, undermine that kind of, core conservative support. I just think that is a position that is not serving the country well, and also to reflexively oppose anything Democrats present, regardless of whether it is useful to the country or not. I think that this is a very unfortunate state of the political system right now. I also want to say that in addition to the points that Carol made about the challenge in obtaining access to abortion care that the Texas law presents, the Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts has for many years operated a hotline, a free hotline for people who are seeking reproductive health care services. And we sadly, there's been a big increase in calls to the hotline from people from states like Texas, where people are really not finding access to the abortion care and other health care they need. And, sometimes the answer is to, try to find a way to bring people to a state like Massachusetts. Oftentimes we're able to connect them with other Planned Parenthood or other reproductive health care resources that are closer to where they live. But people just actually should not have to work that hard to find the healthcare they need. Even in Massachusetts, there are these pregnancy counseling centers that are faux anti-abortion centers. They're not interested in helping women navigate the difficulties of pregnancy or obtaining abortion care if they want it. And sometimes what their approach has done is waste people's valuable time in getting an early, safe abortion, because they, string them along, having, irrelevant conversations, or actually ignoring their questions and cutting them off just hanging up on them when they call, hoping to find services. And so I think that is also, unconscionable. And that kind of challenge and barrier to access to care happens even in states like Massachusetts. If people, don't happen to call Planned Parenthood and call one of these organizations that's kind of masquerading as an organization that will provide access to healthcare, reproductive healthcare services.
I do want to ask about this racial equity piece, and I know that Mississippi is a state in the country with the highest percentage of Black residents in the country, and this state is also one of the country's poorest. Mississippi's Black residents struggle with poverty, with poor education systems, and the effects of depopulation. Abortion access in the state is limited, according to the Guttmacher Institute. And 91% of women in Mississippi do not live in a county with an abortion clinic. So it seems like women in Mississippi already have some huge barriers to reproductive healthcare in this particular case. And so now you have this law, which would make it even more restrictive. When we're talking about this racial justice piece, how do these two connect? Because I think I have rarely seen that connection made, but we do know that maternal mortality among women of color is a major issue. Death outcomes are a major issue. And of course, access to healthcare is a major issue.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. Mississippi is actually one of the 12 states with what they're calling trigger bans, meaning that if Roe is overturned by the Supreme Court, they're going to automatically have a ban on abortion in those states. And disproportionately, those are states mostly in the South, mostly with large populations of people of color and large low-income communities, often with large rural populations. And so there really is this alignment of these laws in these states that have historically oppressed people of color and were actually slave states. And this kind of systemic racism and structural inequality that continues in our country shows up here in the healthcare system. And these restrictions really fall most directly on people of color, low-income people, immigrants, LGBTQ people, people in rural areas and other marginalized communities. And so that's why it's so important to bring that racial equity and gender equity lens when we talk about these issues, because it's not actually an accident or even a coincidence that when in places where the government is trying to actually control people's bodies, there has been a history of trying to do so in a way that oppresses traditionally marginalized communities.
And again, if one were to look at a map of the United States that indicated the states that have adopted the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, the majority there are just a couple of outliers to this generalization, but the majority of states that have not adopted the Medicaid expansion are states like Texas, Mississippi, the states in the Deep South, and with a larger proportion of people of color in the population. And these are people who are just actually cut off by the actions of their own state governments from access to better healthcare services. And so, and I think, as Carol indicated, I don't think that's any coincidence. Actually, I think it's a feature of the political systems of those states. And Crystal, you're absolutely right. I wanted to, reinforce your, your recitation of the statistics about the really sad maternal health outcomes for women of color in the United States. The United States is the only developed country in the world that actually has an increasingly poor record for maternal mortality during pregnancy and childbirth. And the maternal death rate for Black women is more than double that for white women in the United States, with 37.1 deaths per 100,000 live births, as compared to 14.7% for white women. And it's more than 3 times the rate for Hispanic women, which is 11.8%. And if we compare ourselves to other countries, the rate is 3 per 100,000 in countries like the Netherlands and New Zealand. So it is totally possible to make pregnancy outcomes better and healthier for women, and we're not doing it because the conversation really is not about women's health. The conversation is really about trying to keep people in their place. And that's what these laws are attempting to do. And unfortunately, they seem to be succeeding because people don't have access to care.
I just want to add to that because I think Renee is exactly straight on. And even the federal trial court agreed with that in striking down initially the Mississippi ban, which is now on appeal to the Supreme Court. The district court actually said that it's a matter of racial justice and gender equality, and said that this kind of a ban is, quote, closer to the old Mississippi that was intent on controlling women's bodies. So even the courts themselves are acknowledging that this is about control, and particularly control over people of color's bodies. And so in that sense, it is a reflection of the history of this country. And I think we need to see it as such and fight it as such.
I think also one of the things that came up when in doing my research for this show too is that the racial equity piece can often be used on the side of people who are anti-abortion or pro-life or depending on how you call it, and connecting it back to the forced sterilization of women of color throughout history, and saying, well, liberals and as it were, and I'm using air quotes if you're listening, and whatnot, are trying to manipulate this argument. The pro-choice movement is pro-sterilization of women of color. This has been the history of it. How does that narrative damage or harm the conversation about reproductive rights for women of color?
Well, I think first of all, I think we have to acknowledge that there is this tragic history of forced sterilization of people of color, people with limited intellectual abilities, which is not a very admirable part of history. However, that history is largely in the past, not entirely, but largely in the past. And certainly the Planned Parenthood movement is very committed that women can make their own decisions about when and whether, and women and all people, women can make their own decisions about when and whether to bear children. And the important thing is that women should have, and people who want to have children should have that choice and that opportunity, and not have the decision determined by a state law. And so either way, the people who are in favor of access to abortion care are not asserting that abortion care is the right decision for every person. It's the person's decision, and the healthcare providers should help people implement the decision that they want to make and when they find themselves pregnant. And that is really, it's a canard that people are really trying to shove abortion or force people to have abortions against their own self-determination.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that. I mean, I think that any history of forced sterilizations, we have to both acknowledge and then say that that is not what we're talking about here. There's also a history of forcing Black women, enslaved people, to have babies in order to create more slaves, right? So we have that history as well. What we're talking about here is the most important decision that many people make, which is whether or not they want to start a family. It's one of the most personal, private, economically impactful decisions that anybody gets to make. And however a person comes down on that, whether or not whether your religion or your morals or your economics or your political decisions lead you to one decision or another, that is a private decision for people to make in consultation with their families, and not one that the government should be making. So this is really about whether the government should come in and impose its will over you, not whether or not you should have to do one thing or the other. So as Renee said, it is just it's a falsehood to say that this is in any way related to forced sterilizations. And what it really is about is the right of people to choose their destiny. And that is the most fundamental right that's protected under our Constitution. And the fact that these laws are particularly targeting and impacting traditionally marginalized people, people of color, poor people, rural people, LGBTQ people, immigrants, etc., really, I think, reinforces the fact that what's behind these laws is about control by the government and by other people over our futures and our destinies and our bodies. And that's why we, as a patriotic matter, we need to say that that's not the role for the government. That's the role for individuals and our families to make in the privacy of our own homes.
I'm interested where we draw the line. When you had mentioned, Carol, a few times about this is about, individual agency and not about the government controlling what we do. But how do we balance that argument with, say, vaccines or gun control and things like that? Because I think a lot of times that ends up being the counter argument to this here.
So I'll take that one on about the vaccines. I actually don't. I actually think that the vaccine argument is entirely different than this argument. And the reason the vaccine argument is different is because by virtue of walking out in the world with a contagious disease, people can have devastating effects on other people's lives. And there has been a long history in the country of the courts totally backing up the ability of the government to impose certain public health regulations on populations to control things like pandemics or outbreaks of contagious and very dangerous diseases. And so I think one of the tragedies of the current debate about vaccines is that it has turned into this argument about individual autonomy, when in fact, for the vast majority of people, the vaccines pose absolutely no risk. But the risk of the spread of the contagious disease, in this case, we're talking about COVID-19. We've had recent, really very sad outbreaks of measles, which is a disease that has been well controlled for decades by vaccines. That it is an imperative of public health that people take these protective measures to protect themselves and other people that they might interact with. And, people, I know that there's great impatience for kind of returning, social and economic interactions to the way things were before March 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic really descended upon the country. The way to do that is to adopt these essential public health measures. It's not to pretend that the public health measures are somehow infringing on autonomy and freedom. And I would say the same thing about the arguments about gun control. I mean, there really is no reason, and the Supreme Court has acknowledged this in its cases, there is no reason for people to be allowed to have any weapon they want. The Constitution protects some right to have some ability to have access to firearms, but it's not an unlimited right, and it's a public health measure to try to limit some access to firearms and a public safety measure. And so I just think that we don't have full autonomy on some of these decisions that really do have a great societal impact on other people. And the reproductive freedom issue is entirely different because it's about the impact. The outsiders are only looking in and saying, well, I don't agree with the decision you made, but it's not their decision. It's not their lives that we're regulating.
And I completely agree with that. And the ACLU, as the nation's oldest and leading civil liberties organization, also agrees with that. It's a false comparison because when you're talking about vaccinations or gun control, you really are talking about the larger, broader public health, widespread public health implications of these decisions. And that's completely different and not actually comparable to the entirely personal decision that one makes about whether or not, when and whether to have a family.
As we monitor, this Mississippi case is coming up in December 1st, and we go forward to see if there are other challenges, if other states are starting to become more vocal, become more organized around these challenges to Roe v. Wade. What do people really need to be watching and listening for as they try to cut through perhaps some of the noise around this issue and get right to the parts that affect themselves? And I'm speaking specifically if women of color are watching or listening to this. What do they need to be able to hear, to take away from what they're hearing in the media, what they might be talking to at the dinner table if this comes up at Thanksgiving? However, while I respect the topic, I think it would be too much for a holiday. What should people be watching and listening for in terms of keeping themselves educated on this?
Well, I think another another way in which the comparison to the vaccine issue is not actually accurate, but also a way in which we can help think about this. It's something that Carol alluded to earlier, is people have forgotten the tragedies that families experienced when a safe abortion was not legal. And I think that the same thing is true with vaccines. People have forgotten how devastating some of these diseases were, measles, smallpox, polio. They have forgotten the tremendous benefit to society these vaccines present, because people don't have experience with people who've been affected by these diseases. And so I think that we need to have a sense of history and how, the social order and social arrangements and our rights that we can exercise right now have really been, we've been empowered by, the right to have legal abortion and the progress of science on vaccines. And we need to embrace those changes and not really enact laws that take us back to a former time where people experienced great tragedy or had no control over their lives because the laws limited their choices about reproductive health care.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I also think, I hope people have the takeaway that your vote matters and your voice matters on these things. Just last year in 2020, we passed here in Massachusetts the Roe Act that says that whatever the Supreme Court rules on Roe versus Wade, abortion will not be recriminalized here in Massachusetts. But that's not enough. We need to make sure that abortion access is available not only as a legal matter, but as an economic matter, along with contraceptive access. And every state legislature across the country is looking at bills, including here in Massachusetts, from anti-abortion activists or anti-women activists, really, that would say you don't have a right to contraception, you don't have a right to abortion, you don't have a right to reproductive health care, either as an economic or a legal matter. So I think it's so important that, number one, we keep pressing back, we keep fighting back on those, and we push instead to make sure that reproductive and health care is available to everyone economically, as an economic matter as well as a legal matter. That number two, we recognize that when these laws are being pushed, there actually really are attacks on people based on gender, race, socioeconomic status, and that we push back for those reasons. And number three, that we recognize that it's so important that we call our state legislators when there are bills before it, that we get involved with Planned Parenthood or the ACLU or whatever groups that you care about, and that you take action, because literally 3, 4, 5 phone calls to a state legislator can completely change that person's vote. So few people are engaged right now in our political system that a few voices can really be heard loud and clear and can change the world. So I just want to emphasize that people can't just sit back and assume the courts will take care of it or someone else will take care of it. Every time you make a call, every time you write a letter, send an email, take an action, it really has an influence and it really strengthens our democracy and can actually change the laws. So I would just encourage everyone to get politically engaged, to stay politically engaged, and to recognize that, hope is a political act, and we get hope because we fight the fights. And we may lose some, we may win some, but the most important is that we engage in the struggle going forward, because therein lies our hope for our democracy.
Right. There's no complacency. I would say that there is this tendency to become complacent with the status quo, that, things seem good enough. And really, how dangerous could people who promise to make radical changes in reproductive health care or any other kind of right that we might experience, how dangerous could they be? Well, we've seen what can happen with that in some of these states. And so I think that it's very important. The other thing is that Carol mentioned this right at the beginning of our conversation about the connection between the political system and the courts. Yes, we hope that in individual cases, the judges are making decisions on the law, the facts, and for by and large, that often happens. But the politicians select judges, and in many states, judges are elected. And so it's very important for people to have on the horizon that it actually does matter who the politicians are saying they will appoint to the judiciary, and who in the states that elect judges, who people are saying, who they are electing to judicial positions. Because as we've seen, the philosophies, the legal philosophies of the people who are on the courts makes a big difference in how some of these challenges play out. So I think that you can't separate, the judiciary is an important consideration when considering who you're going to vote for.
All right. Well, ladies, we're going to have to leave it there. Riveting conversation, so important, breaking down these legal concepts about history of racism, reproductive rights, and these new laws, these new challenges in the Supreme Court right now. With me today in conversation, Carol Rose of the ACLU of Massachusetts and Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts Board Chair, and Constitutional Law Professor Renee Landers. Thank you so much again for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. I want to remind everyone that you can go ahead and listen to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Common Narrative Media. You can go ahead and search wherever you find your podcast. That's where we are. And of course, we have the Thanksgiving holiday, but we are still going to bring you some really great content on Spark FM online coming up next Sunday. We will see you then. For now, remember, knowledge is power. And power is change. We'll see you next time. This is Common Narrative on Spark FM.